Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Malika Pritchett. Welcome, Malika.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
Happy to have you here. Before we get started, I just want to share that I am producing and hosting this podcast on the territories of the Klaamin, Homoko, Klehus, and Comox First Nations, which sort of surround my island that I live on. And the island I live on is called Sayayin in the Klaamin language. And the village I live in is called Isam in the Klaamin language. And right now I don't have the translations with me, but essentially they both refer to they're kind of land references. Isam, I think, means end of the bay, which makes sense because the sort of settler term is Gillies Bay, so I live in a bay. And I believe Sayayin is sort of like end of island or end of land, something like that. Something sort of just to represent the landmass of the island. And it's called Texada Island, named after a Spanish colonizer who apparently just sailed past the island. He didn't actually even stop here, but somehow the ship went by, and we're going to name it after him. You can look. I think his name is actually, and I can see if we can find a link to it. But I think his last name is actually we spell it Texada, but I think his name is Tej. ADA, maybe Tayada or something like that. Anyway, the Klaamin First Nation is kind of on the mainland where I would kind of commute to go get my groceries, and the other three First Nations are kind of on Vancouver Island, which is sort of the bigger island west of me. But there's this website called nativeland.ca. I think it's native-land.ca. And I don't know, I know it's a .ca website, so that's Canadian, but I think it may deal with some American sites. Essentially, you go to this website and you can look up, it's sort of like a Google Maps type thing, and you can look up where you live, and it'll show you all the Indigenous First Nations that are on the land. So it won't actually say, so I'm sort of Vancouver is sort of the biggest city here. You won't say Vancouver. It'll just have all of the different individual Indigenous First Nations. And when you look at that site, it's on our island. It seems like all of these First Nations have little sections of it. I know Klaamin definitely has specific lands here, and I think they have sort of the biggest claim to the island these days, and they're certainly the ones that are doing the most over here. I think primarily just because they can access it from their community, where the Vancouver Island folks don't have a direct route here, unless they're going in sort of solo boats. But the ocean gets a bit rocky these days, so I don't know if they're doing that too much anymore. Anyway, as I understand it, and I've been saying this sort of in every territorial acknowledgement, I probably should confirm it again somewhere, but I'm pretty sure that all four of those First Nations were one sort of nation, one community sort of thing before we kind of split them off. And I think a lot of folks know that sort of pre-colonizing, there were no borders, there were no lines, it was all just land. And so these First Nations are part of a larger sort of I don't know what you call it, group of First Nations called the Coast Salish First Nations, and there's quite a few of those down in Washington and Oregon and then all the way up sort of BC's coast towards kind of Alaska, the Yukon. So just a massive sort of community. And I was also saying, folks will know, folks who are paying close attention, and I've had a few guests, or had a few sort of listeners actually acknowledge this. So it was great that they're listening. But so I was talking to somebody the other day. I said, I'm really learning lots about land acknowledgements thanks to you. And I said, oh, no, that's great. It's actually I learned recently in a workshop I went to by a guy named Len Pierre. He owns a company called Len Pierre Consulting, LEN, and it's Pierre, Pierre. And he's a charismatic young Indigenous guy that's been doing a lot of really cool kind of sort of cultural safety, cultural humility. He's got a company, and he's been working with our company quite a bit to help us kind of in our process of truth and reconciliation. And he's been putting on these sort of lunch and learn webinars, kind of one a month. And he did one recently called Transformative Territorial Acknowledgements. It's amazing. I'm going to share it in the show notes. Really applies to sort of anyone who lives in any kind of community where there might be, sort of Indigenous people still there, and or Indigenous lands, and that's pretty much everywhere. And one thing he talks about is kind of how, and I have to go back and look at it again, but I might be butchering this, but kind of how he likes to call them territorial acknowledgements versus land acknowledgements, because we're not really acknowledging the land, because the land is just, the dirt per se, but we're acknowledging their relationship to the land and sort of that sort of two-way kind of connection there. I think some might get a little offended by me just calling it the dirt. I think there's a sort of there's still a deeper sort of connection and description of it, but it's that relationship versus the actual sort of earth, rock, and water that is really important. So I'm starting to call them territorial acknowledgements and learn something new every day about those sorts of things. So I'm looking forward to kind of diving in. I've been doing a little bit of work learning about the history of the Klamath First Nation, and found a series of newsletters that some anthropologists put together, and that tells a lot of stories. So I'm starting to read some of those, but I don't have any facts in front of me to share, so I'll save that for a future episode. So today we're going to be talking about a bunch of different things. We're talking a little bit about some of Malika's research, but I think more so just kind of her passion and what you've kind of become known for, I think, in a lot of ways in more recent times. I think, and that's a whole other point, I think, but in more recent times, you've been kind of recognized for your work in kind of the area of social justice and human rights and those sorts of things. So we're going to be kind of talking about behavior analysis somewhat, but this just general sort of, I think, research practices and whatnot, and kind of the history of research. And we keep talking about reform in different areas, and and trying to change what we're doing, but I think, especially in light of some of the ridiculous things that are happening in some places in the US right now around sort of essentially erasing history, or not wanting to tell true histories. There's a lot of things I think people who are in research should know about research and kind of where it came from. There's a lot of people that read research and sort of make decisions on their life or in their practice based on research, that should know kind of where that all came from, and should know whether there's we often get taught kind of how to read research in our graduate programs, and that's great, but we don't get taught the history of research, and we certainly don't get taught we don't get taught some of the things that I think are coming out more and more now around. There's sort of components of research that aren't required by. There's sort of aspects of research, I say, that aren't required by journals to sort of be published that maybe should be, and and so it's not just an issue of sort of, researchers themselves, but it's an issue of the systems that researchers kind of work in. So we're going to be touching on a lot of really kind of cool things in there. I said initially in the beginning, just a minute ago about, that you're known for social justice, but it was interesting. I released a podcast today with and I've been doing a lot around kind of in terms of Black History Month. I kind of promotion going out right now with all my Black guests. The CEUs are free for folks right now, just to kind of get the word out. And I've been interviewing, and coincidentally, I've been interviewing a lot of Black guests this month. It was not planned this way. It just so happened that all the ones I reached out to wanted to meet in February, and so I've just been kind of building more and more on kind of that knowledge. And so today's interview that I published was with Dr. Denise Ross Page, Dr. Amoy Hugh-Penny, Dr. Maya Hernandez, and Dr. Margot Aweo. And they were introducing themselves and talking about how long they'd been in the field. Denise said she's been in the field for like over 30 years. Amoy was, 26, 27 years. And I got to thinking, I hadn't heard of any of these people until 2020. I've heard lots of other people, but I haven't heard of any of these folks. And I actually, sort of, again, bias coming in, thought they were all just brand new behavior analysts coming onto the field. Not Denise Ross so much, because I think she's just got like a wide breadth of sort of work that she's involved in, that sort of hints that she's probably been doing this for a while. But still, I hadn't heard of her either, before the last few years. And and it just really speaks to, I think, again, a lot of the problems in our field and a lot of the problems in our world, that there are so many brilliant people doing really, really cool work. And I think this is the part that I don't know people grasp. I think I sometimes wonder if people wonder why, a lot of my guests, are, come from kind of these more kind of marginalized populations, and it might even look from the outside like I'm just sort of picking and choosing solely based on sort of skin color, for someone who wouldn't listen to the episodes, do any reading, and I'm not, but I kind of am, because these folks that I'm picking are these people, and I don't know if it's sort of the just the different kind of lives these folks have had to live, the world they've had to grow up in that just wasn't, sort of recognizing them as humans, and just sort of having just a sort of different sort of, I don't know what it is, it's a strength for sure, whatever it is. The stuff that yourself and many of my guests are putting out is just so cool and so interesting. And I find the stuff that's, that's not to say that, folks that, are, maybe are white or white passing or whatever, aren't putting out good work. But it's just so much other work that I had no idea existed, and so many conversations I had no idea you could have in the context of our field. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of explain that thought I had at the beginning there, because I think, it's much like sort of the idea that, Black history is just slavery and there was nothing before that, or Indigenous history was just, residential schools and there was nothing before that, or and there's just so much rich information out there. It's so much rich information and knowledge and stories, and just the way, some of these, groups just look at the worldview. That's a term I've been hearing a lot more lately. Worldview. I have an Indigenous colleague that often talks about in her practice. She right in her bio on her website, she's a BCBA, but she talks about how she does her work from an Indigenous worldview. And I love that whole worldview thing, because, we need more worldviews. So yeah. Anyway, so I'm just I would never have talked about social justice and those sorts of things. And I think maybe that's because the folks that we were talking to beforehand, weren't having issues because they're privileged and they're they don't need social justice because they've got sort of access to everything and so on and so forth. But I don't know what it is, but I don't want to ramble too much here, but it just makes me think and I continue to have. I had a great conversation this morning with an interview I'm going to be doing in the March with two behavior analysts, one from Nigeria and one from Ghana, and one of them was talking about how she was, up until recently, she thought she was the only behavior analyst in Nigeria because she just had no idea that there were people floating around, and talking about sort of the very beginnings of behavior analysis. They're in a place where half the population, sort of the autism context, half the folks that have kids with autistic kids don't even know that their kids are autistic, don't know what autism is, don't know what ABA is, still are using sort of treatments or kind of spiritual treatments or other things that, or expecting sort of like a pill to solve all their problems and those sorts of things. And just most of the behavior analysts on our neck of the woods didn't have to deal with any of this stuff, and didn't have to have that perspective. And it's just there's just so many cool perspectives. So I'm just I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm just really grateful to be able to have this podcast and to be able to have really cool guests like yourself that just have a different perspective and they're willing to share it, and it's enriching my life and my mind, and I hope other people's as well.
I think it is, Ben. And I think that people say I could just talk to you for hours, and they don't really mean it. But you and I have actually done it.
Yeah.
So I think it's great, and I'm now a loyal listener. And when you reached out to me, I had heard about your podcast, but I'm not a podcast type of person, right? Like if I'm going to put my AirPods in, I'm going to listen to music. Music like moves me through my day, my workouts, everything that I do. I have a soundtrack to my life, right? And I make different playlists, but your podcast, in addition to a few others that I've been turned on to, have really been helpful for me to hear diverse perspectives, especially because a lot of times when we do have the luxury and the opportunity to go to conferences, folks are so busy. Some people aren't at certain conferences. It's hard to catch up with different people. So I really do appreciate one of the gifts of the pandemic being that people are more likely to connect virtually and more likely to share ideas. And there just is a better dissemination process for, like you said, a bunch of smart folks across the world that are doing cool stuff. Yeah,
right on. Well, as always, I like to sort of start with a bit of the origin story of my guests. One of these days, I'm going to have a guest on twice, and maybe I won't ask this question in the beginning, but so until we get there, we'll keep going. So curious, kind of how you found ABA and kind of how you got in the field, but also, how you got to sort of this sort of social justice focus.
Gosh, that is a long, windy road. I'm going to try and.
I like the long words.
I'm going to try and synthesize this because I bet it would sound a bit of a mess if you follow this trajectory. So I think the biggest thing is I've always been naturally curious, in the sense of from childhood. I'd always been interested in lots of different things, and I was very inquisitive and had lots of questions. And from as early as I can remember, which is probably like 4 or 5 years old, my parents probably just grew tired of answering all of Malika's questions. I think it was just exhausting. And so what they did was they put a bookshelf. There's a bookshelf that was in our house, built-in bookshelves, really pretty, and the long hall of bookshelves. And on the very bottom row was my height, and they were always filled with books. So I had a mini library from as long as I can remember,
Hmm.
because my parents were just probably exhausted and I was probably asking questions they didn't know the answer to.
Hmm.
So my dad just used to say, I don't know, look it up.
Hmm.
And that has always been the way that I was reared. I don't know, look it up. And
Hmm.
question asking was not punished necessarily, but redirected. And to this day, I love bookshelves and libraries.
Hmm.
And the more books I can have, it's becoming a problem, especially with, them arriving at your doorstep so easily. But
Yes.
nonetheless, I say that to say I've always been very curious and I've always been interested in how things worked. And so I was just a natural researcher and scientist as a young one,
Hmm.
and always was very interested in science and went to I grew up in North Texas, in
Hmm.
Allen, Texas specifically,
Hmm.
and always had access, such a privileged educational opportunity, right? Always had access to a lot of smart people, a
Hmm.
lot of resources. My dad was in the tech field, so the minute anything new technological came out, I had it in my home before anybody
Hmm.
else. I was researching on the internet, I was on AOL before
Hmm.
anybody else. I had the fastest internet connection in my neighborhood. So I've always had information at my fingertips by virtue of the way that my family arranged my environment. And I decided really early on that I was going to be a scientist. And I decided that I wanted to, my family, a portion of my family, my grandmother, aunts, and uncles lived in San Diego, California. And I decided in high school I was going to be a marine biologist. I wanted out
Hmm.
of Texas, nothing more to do with Texas. I was out of there and got accepted to San Diego State University and was very proud of myself. I do have these points in my life where I get too proud of myself and not humble enough. And age
Hmm.
17 was a very different Malika. Because I was smart and I had privilege and I had access to a lot of great education, and I was going to leave Texas and I was really excited for myself. So I didn't really care about my grades second half of the semester. I got out to San Diego State University to study marine biology. I put a down payment down for my apartment and was just really proud of myself,
Hmm.
and went to go enroll in classes, and the administrative person said, your provisional admission to the university has been revoked. You cannot come here.
What?
You cannot register for classes. Well, and this is a cautionary tale for anybody that gets a provisional admission to any sort of college or university around the world, if they're still doing them. I haven't really
Hmm.
kept up with the times, but the thought process was for San Diego State University, we want to be sure that California residents get priority access to our university. And if you come from out of
Hmm.
state and your GPA falls below the GPA that you had when you were admitted to the
Hmm.
university after your last semester of your senior year of high school, then we'll revoke your admission and we'll give it to another person. So my admission probably went to a California resident that perhaps was on a waiting list or something like that.
Right.
So my first entry and my first step with college education or higher education was horrific.
Yeah.
And I came back to my very small town. There's only one high school in my town, and I had to answer the question to every person I saw. I'm not
Hmm.
exaggerating. I thought you were going to school in California. And I literally had to just retell this story
Ugh.
over and over and over again, because I'm an honest person. I'm
Yeah.
transparent. I was embarrassed, but it
Yeah.
was what it was. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I ended up enrolling at the very last minute at my local community college. Walked through the doors of community college with a pretty big chip on my shoulder. I was pretty
Hmm.
annoyed with myself, my circumstances. How am I going to be a marine biologist in Texas? Like,
Hmm.
these are the problems of a 18-year-old at the time, right? But I found some of the best professors I've ever, to this day, ever
Hmm.
encountered in community college.
Wow.
And got my associate's degree in science and loved community college so much and loved my professors so much that the advisors were like, okay, you're done. Like, you have an associate's degree, you need to leave. You need,
Hmm.
like, you're going to get a bachelor's degree, right? I'm like, yeah, for sure.
Sure.
They were like, okay, so you got to leave. This institution doesn't offer that. So I kind of got kicked out in a different way community college. But while I was there, I ran into some amazing professors, and one of them is my friend to this day and mentor. And he was a history professor. And I went to office hours one day. Office hours was a really interesting thing to me. And I went to office hours one day and I said, listen, I really love community college and I love college and I love learning. Like, this is really my jam. I could do this for a very long time. I love going to school. And he was like, well, you could be a professor and then you just do this every day. And I hounded him in his office hours. And I was like, well, what do you do? Well, I come and I prepare my lesson and then you see me teach and then I grade and then I sit here for office hours. And I was like, and this is your career. Like, you do this all the time. And so, long story short, at age like 18, 19, my freshman year in undergrad, I decided I was going to be a college professor, or at least I was going to get a PhD. That was just that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I had figured that out. And through an interesting turn of events while I was at community college, I made a good friend that she was able to take American Sign Language in high school. And she taught me some sign language over the summer. And I got really excited about it. And she told me that I was really good at it. She was like, you're picking up this language really quickly. It took me a couple years to learn everything that you know so far. I think you should take some classes at your community college. And that was just another reason to stay at community college for another year. So I got a certificate in, I believe the certificate was in something related to American Sign Language, probably American Sign Language certificate. I have to go back and look. And I became an interpreter. So I started paying for college as an interpreter and was able to not have to take student loans out at the undergraduate level. I was able to just work, interpret. It paid really well. I met a lot of really cool people, went to a lot of different environments as an interpreter. And then my advisors and my mentors at community college were like, well, what are you going to do for your bachelor's degree? And I was like, well, maybe I'll take sign language and science and mush them together. And they were like, well, I don't know how you do that, but there's a school down the road, but it was about an hour away, called Texas Women's University. And they have a deaf education program and a speech language pathology program. That sounds like an audiology program. That sounds like what you're going for. And so that's what I did. So I went and I finished my bachelor's degree in communication sciences and disorders. And I was pretty convinced I was going to go into deaf education. And I was probably going to leave the science behind, which did not make me very happy. And I also didn't feel very prepared. I did some student teaching opportunities in classrooms where there were children that were deaf or hard of hearing. And I saw a lot of challenging behaviors in those classroom settings. For obvious reasons, right? Speaking to a group of behavior analysts, they're like, well, yeah. But for me, at the time, I had just finished my bachelor's degree and I knew that I was wholly unprepared and really not very motivated to go into a master's degree in deaf education without understanding why people are doing the things that they're doing. I thought there was something really critical that was missing.
Yes.
I could teach language or maybe American Sign Language all day, but it was more complicated and I knew that. So I had another crisis, right? So my second crisis was I'm in this education thing for the long haul, but I know I need to make pit stops along the way and gain some practical experience. And so, so my next kind of crossroads, I went to a barbecue. It was a barbecue. I was, crying in my beer in the backyard about, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And a friend of a friend walked up to me named Donnie Staff. And Donnie came over and he was like, hey, listen, I'm at the University of North Texas, which is literally down the street from Texas Women's University. It's in Denton, Texas. Both of those universities are. I'm down the street at UNT. I'm studying behavior analysis. It's a master's program. You don't have to move out of Denton. You don't have to go anywhere. Like, are you interested? And that was all the pitch that I needed. He explained to me what behavior analysis was. He explained all of the different avenues that I could study, it feels infinite sometimes with the science of behavior, all the things you can study. And walked into the department at UNT and walked around, saw students doing really cool stuff. I saw data. I saw motivated learning. I saw a place where scientists could come and flourish and ask really important questions. And I applied to the University of North Texas to study behavior analysis.
Hmm.
And it was the only school I applied to. I had no idea if I was going to get in. For all intents and purposes, I don't know why they admitted me. I didn't
Hmm.
have any background in behavior analysis,
Hmm.
perhaps my background in communication sciences and disorders. And I'd worked hard. I had good letters of recommendation, was a good reason for them to let me in. And the cohorts are very small at UNT at the master's level. They're about 20 students. So I was one
Hmm.
of, I think, probably about 20, if I'm not mistaken. And then that's literally how I stumbled in to behavior analysis. What I didn't know I stumbled into is one of the best behavior analytic programs in the world. And so I guess the moral of the story is it's okay to have crises and have no idea what to do in life and cry in your beer in a backyard, because you might run into somebody who changes your trajectory really quickly. So I'm forever grateful for Donnie for just at least being human enough to have a conversation with a girl that was like, I don't know what to do with my life.
Right on. Did the That's awesome. That's an
Yeah.
awesome story. Did you do anything more with sort of the deaf piece after that, or?
So the deaf community has always found me throughout my career, right?
Hmm.
There's always a there's always a client in need that uses sign language. It's a very specific specialty. So
Yeah.
I've continued to be of service. My skills are not nearly the skills as they were as far as being an interpreter was concerned, and I'm no longer certified. But
Hmm.
I continue to use my sign language skills, and I'm not too rusty. And what I do is I do spend a lot of time making sure that I access the deaf community through YouTube videos and different social media platforms, just so I can hear what they're saying and
Hmm.
make sure I still understand. But that is something that I've been reflecting on pretty heavily, that I will probably re-engage with the deaf community, because it was a lot of fun. Becoming a behavior analyst is pretty exhausting. So I took a little bit of a turn.
Yeah. Yeah. Really cool. Yeah. I did an interview a month or so ago with um, Dr. Siobhan Sutter. Do you know that name?
No.
She's a BCBAD at, I think it's University of Nevada, Reno,
Ah,
and she coordinates a deaf-blind education program.
wow.
Yeah, which
That's
was
super cool.
really fascinating, and and I haven't heard of a lot of behavior analysts sort of working in you know in the deaf community. I know there's a young woman right now she's a BCBA. I think her name's Jackie, and I might butcher this last name. I think it's German. I think it's Wunderlich. Wunderlich, I think is her last name. And she's a deaf BCBA, and she's on Instagram. You gotta find out what her handle is. I'll put in the show notes. But she's just doing a lot of really cool dissemination around working with the deaf and whatnot. And I do want to at some point try to figure out if I can uh, get an interpreter and bring her on the podcast at some point. But that's been neat. And then I had a colleague that was one of my grad school instructors, and she was a deaf educator, BCBA, worked in the school for the deaf. But it didn't seem like it doesn't seem like there's a lot of folks doing that in our field. Do you know, or have you noticed, or?
No.
Yeah.
And maybe that will be a good opportunity point for me also to
Mm.
re-engage and gather folks that are doing similar work or interested in similar work, because those fields are very close.
Hmm.
And the reason why I scuttled away from being getting a master's degree in deaf education was because there were so many challenging behaviors in the classroom setting that I didn't know what to do with and needed to know more about before I could be of any service to anybody. And so that overlap seems very logical.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of well, not a lot. There's definitely several sort of developmental disabilities, genetic syndromes, or whatever that where the challenge behavior presents similar to what you might see with um, autistic folks and that sort of thing. But deafness is often a component of those syndromes.
Hmm.
And often I think folks are, these folks might not be sort of, and because of their disability, and this I mean, I know this isn't the point of today's conversation, but because of their disability, I don't even know what, I don't know if you'd call it sort of deaf ableism. I don't even know what the term would be, but because of their disabilities, these folks aren't part of the deaf community, right?
Yes.
And I don't think it's that they're not welcome. So I don't think that's fair to call it a deaf ableism thing. I think the deaf community would welcome these folks with open arms. They seem to be pretty, if you're deaf, they're inclusive, sort of thing. They don't have a lot of strict requirements as far as I understand. My wife has a similar kind of track as you. She did a bachelor's degree in communications and did the deaf interpreter course as well. She never actually became an interpreter, but she did some interpreting sort of in her work with some clients and whatnot. So I've learned a little bit about sort of the deaf community from her, but yeah, point being that there are these sort of pockets of deaf people that would probably really benefit from accessing the deaf community and having those kinds of supports, but they don't, and so they end up with hearing staff and hearing consultants and hearing professionals and then they get labeled as hearing impaired versus deaf, and there's all those conversations as well. But I think there's just a lot of folks that don't know what to do when there's when there's no hearing. So
Yeah. And it's okay to not know what you're doing,
Mm.
but it's also not okay to just trudge forward assuming that you're doing the best that you can do in that moment. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
people's lives are way too important for me to just trudge ahead and hope that I'm doing the best. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm actually, as you heard from my stories, I'm more likely to, at any space and time of confrontation, or me feeling like I don't have the skills to do something or whatever it may be in life,
Mm.
I am way more likely to turn around the other way. I'm very fine with U-turns in life.
Mm. Mm.
But yeah, that would be really cool to re-engage with the deaf community now that I have a little bit more time
Mm.
and um, see what they've been up to. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. You answered part one of my question, which was kind of how you got into the field of ABA.
Uh-huh.
Part two was, how did you become so interested in social justice? There is a lack of diversity when it comes to educational material depicting Black children in the field of applied behavior analysis. Human Expressions gives Black and brown children realistic and detailed images of kids who look like them, modeling everyday skills that may be difficult for them to communicate or express. At Human Expressions, the benefits of representation for Black and brown kids in educational curricula are clear: increased self-esteem, reducing stereotypes, and increased validation and support. To learn more, go to www.humanexpressions.org. That's human, HUEMAN, expressions.org. Hey everybody, if you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is justice.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that, well, I know that that also has to do with how I was raised, and my grandparents worked in the United Nations. They worked
Mm,
in different aspects of the United Nations. My grandfather represented the country of Sudan,
mm,
and he was an economist. His whole interest was in what he was tasked with doing for the country of Sudan before it was before the Civil War and before South Sudan was a separate country.
mm,
Um, he was tasked with removing British rule from the Sudan, required, as it does with any country where the colonizers remove themselves rule wise and infrastructure wise from a country, is to ensure that the country can sustain itself. And so his role with the UN was to make sure that the economy of the Sudan was self sustainable once the British rule had transitioned.
mm.
So,
Wow.
right?
Big job.
Smart dude. um, and he got his he's from Sudan, he's from Khartoum, and got his PhD at Oxford University, and
Wow.
just kind of lived a very interesting life. I never had the opportunity to meet him, so I just have the
Mm,
stories from my mother, and have the pictures around our home that she was sure to make sure that, we had a visual representation of my grandfather.
mm,
And then and these are my maternal grandparents that I'm referring to now.
mm.
My maternal grandmother is from Scotland, and her link with the United Nations is she was trained as a physician, as an OBGYN,
Wow.
and she joined the United Nations to serve Northeast Africa. She was all over Northeast Africa. And the thought process was that she wanted to be sure that reproductive rights were upheld, and
Mm,
that women specifically had access to birth control, so that they weren't in these family structures where they were just continuing to have children without any access to birth control. So that's what my grandmother did. And so through the United Nations, my grandfather from the Sudan met my grandmother from Scotland, and
ah,
they married at a time, can you imagine? They married at a time where a Black man and a white woman getting married was just almost unheard of.
mhm,
And I don't know if luckily or not, because the UK has its own tenuous history with race and race relations and things like that. But um, all of that to say, I'm the my mother met my father in Saudi Arabia and immigrated to the United States in the early 80s, right before I was born. So
wow.
I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and on top of that, I'm the granddaughter of the United Nations. So
Mhm,
being interested in human rights and social justice was not an option. It was a conversation at the dinner table all the time.
mm,
It was just kind of who I was. Where I had a very difficult time was as a teenager. w- Once you transition out of childhood and you go into becoming a teenager and a young adult, you realize that all the adults around you really don't know what they're doing, and sometimes they do really horrific things. That was a really difficult point in my life. I remember being very, very sad. And I would venture to say, looking back, I was probably clinically depressed at age like
mm,
15, 16.
wow.
Once I started to realize I mean, I'm more mature and thinking about things differently, but at the time I would have said how awful people can be to other people. That was
Mm,
horrific to me. I
mm,
don't think most teenagers have that. Most teenagers, especially now being a mother and raising them, are going through a lot emotionally, but I was going through a lot emotionally because of how horrific people could be to other people of other races, of other
mm,
ethnicities, of other religions. That was really difficult for me.
mm.
So I guess a lot of it is why I'm interested in science and why I'm interested in human rights and justice with regard to humans is probably just because of the environment I was raised in, which doesn't sound very exciting. It is what it is, right? As behavior analysts, but I've never really had an option. I've never not option. I've just never really not cared about those things, and it's just progressed to this day.
I don't know how having grandparents with that story can be anything but exciting. Um,
Yeah.
um, it's 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 like your story is like straight out of a movie.
Mm.
Be a good movie too.
Well, if there's a way I can get a little bit of money for my kids to go to college and
I
their
mean,
grandkids
I'd
and their
love to hear
grandkids.
the story about your grandparents, sort of like in full, you know, the full, like from their youth and all that kind of thing. Because I imagine they each have an amazing story of kind of how you get to the UN, right? I mean, alone is got to be a pretty fantastic. Did they get where did they get married?
That's a really good question. I'm going to have to ask my mother that question.
Yeah.
For the majority of my remembering, they spent a majority of their time in Nairobi.
Hmm.
So, but maybe
And,
that's where my parents got married, my father and mother. Maybe that I'm mixing those two
and when are
stories
we
up.
talking? I'm not very good with dates for when you say grandparents. I mean, my
Yeah.
grandparents were like my grandfather was born in 1903. So I mean, I
Uh,
think yeah, I think you're talking a bit later than that.
yeah, I'm a little younger than you.
Hmm.
Was my grandfather wrote his dissertation in 1949,
Okay.
and my mom is the oldest of just two children,
Hmm.
and she was born in 56. So
Hmm.
let's just say somewhere in the early 1950s.
Hmm. That
Good
makes sense.
question.
So your grandparents are probably around the same age as would be around the same age maybe as my parents.
Yeah.
But yeah, just for the whole, you know, um, black man and a white woman marrying and where and when that was happening. You know, it obviously they didn't get married in you know in the U.S., which probably
No.
wouldn't have happened. Um, or if it did, it would have been problematic, to say the least.
My grandmother was I knew my grandmother throughout my life. So my grandfather
Hmm.
passed away before I was born, but I knew my grandmother
Oh,
throughout my
okay,
life. And
great.
by virtue of perhaps being Scottish is a portion of it, perhaps working through the United Nations and having a humanitarian worldview is another part of it,
Hmm.
perhaps being a physician that championed for women's rights and reproductive rights was another part of it. But her entire side of the family, from the way my mother tells the story, was horrific towards my grandfather and also my mother and uncle, who was this children of this union, right? These
Hmm.
biracial children of this union.
Hmm.
And they completely cut her off from family communications, but
Hmm.
she couldn't care less. There's a story that
Hmm.
the country of Scotland at one point in time was threatening her passport, and she told him to have it, like threw it at him. Like
Hmm.
she did, she just was this woman who really didn't have any problems with nor tolerance with people being unjust, right? Like
Hmm.
if you don't want to be around my children and you don't want to respect the fact that I'm married to a black man, then you have your family. And so I have no contact with the Scottish side of my family, but
Hmm.
one of these days I am very interested in genealogy. One of these days I'll
Hmm.
do the work of tracing these
Yeah.
folks back, because it was a generational issue
Hmm.
that I hope doesn't stand to this day, but who knows?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm still really interested in this origin story. Normally, I move on to the main topics by now, but
That's okay.
this is just really fascinating. Um, well, first question is obviously your grandparents, but were your parents also interested in kind of social justice? Obviously, I mean, I know they're immigrants, but that's
Yeah, so my mom is an immigrant. She Because my grandparents were in the United Nations, they traveled a lot. That is
mm,
one of the downfalls, is you have children, but you travel a lot. So she grew up in boarding schools in England, which again is another very privileged type of existence, right? And you have to be very wealthy to go to boarding schools, and then you are around very wealthy uh, other peers and my parents are in the United Nations. My parents,
Yeah,
on and
yeah.
on. So that was her kind of purview, but she was born in the Sudan, so was not a citizen of the UK. She could not stay in England
Mm,
after she had graduated from school, went back to the Sudan, decided this isn't the life for me, and decided to become a flight attendant for Saudi Arabian Airlines.
mm,
And so she was flying around the world for Saudi Arabian Airlines. And my dad, this is a whole nother side of the story, right? My father is from just outside of Chicago, Illinois, from a town called Waukegan.
mm,
And he joined the military, joined the army. He served in Vietnam. He ended up in Saudi Arabia. And my parents met at a party in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, because they just had mutual friends.
mm,
And she was really excited to meet these American guys that were in the military.
mm,
And they had a whirlwind type of romance, 6 months worth of romance. They married in Kenya.
mm.
My dad ended up getting a job in Dallas, Texas,
Wow.
and brought my mom with him.
Mm,
And that's the story. They were married all the way up until my dad passed away a couple years ago. So
mm.
my brother and I, growing up in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, is really not very romantic compared to all of our compared to our family members. I don't think my brother resents it, but I'm a little salty. Like I could be living anywhere in the world, and I mean, I love Texas. I still live here to this day, but it was like, man, you guys have been all over the world,
Mm.
and here I am. But now I forgot your question, Ben. Did I answer
No,
your
you
question?
answered it. So it definitely, I mean, the foundations for social justice are there, but yet still your academic career was going towards sort of deaf and hard of hearing. It wasn't even, and then eventually, into behavior analysis. So
Hmm.
where does the social justice thing, now become, part of your work suddenly,
Sure. So at the University of North Texas, I had the really, really immense pleasure and luxury in a lot of respects to at UNT there was several faculty members that were all interested in all aspects of behavior analysis.
Mm,
So I spent a considerable amount of my time learning from each one of the professors throughout classes and through joining different labs and um, gaining lots of life experiences as a student, as a master's degree student. So understanding what functional analyses were, understanding what functional behavior assessments were, understanding what it meant to work with adolescents and adults diagnosed with intellectual and developmental disabilities, understanding what early intensive behavioral intervention was, and working in an autism clinic, and um, you know, hearing for the first time what discrete trial training was, and
mm,
naturalistic teaching and incidental teaching. So anyway, on and on and on, working in schools, I got a lot of different experiences because the faculty there were so diverse and had
mm,
so many wonderful and exciting areas of interest. And so I decided to, at my master's degree level, I decided to get my master's degree with Dr. Shala Lai Rosales,
uh-huh,
who not only has expertise in early intensive behavioral interventions, but also has a very distinct expertise in understanding the family context and the family
mm,
ecology and how
mm,
culture impacts services.
mhm,
So, one of the things that we did when we were at the University of North Texas is we had to do lots of different labs and practicums, as every up and coming behavior analyst does, who's interested in becoming a scientist practitioner and certified as a BCBA. And so one of our sites that I worked at was a clinic for children with autism. But the mission of the clinic was very purposeful. And Dr. Shalala Rosales and Jesus Rosales Ruiz led the clinic development and mission. And the mission was a very particular mission in that anybody could be served in that clinic regardless of their ability to pay, regardless
mm,
of their, you know, um, different barriers potentially that most of the time children with autism can't access services because of disparities, right? Because of social justice issues, because of, perhaps English not being the native language of the household, not being savvy enough with the healthcare system, immigrant status, level of income in the home, number of children in the home that are diagnosed with autism, for example. So what that lab did and what that clinic did is it said, yes, we're going to provide optimal services, and we're going to be sure that all of these children receive early intensive behavioral interventions or applied behavior analytics services, depending on what their needs were. And we're going to ensure that this is done for the entire community in the North Texas area, regardless of these barriers that exist in our society. And so understanding disparities was that was my first introduction into understanding disparities and understanding what it meant to create a clinic that sought to eliminate those disparities. So that I think that that's probably where, well, I know that that's where my interest in reducing and eliminating disparities and increasing access to services for children with autism or people, period, who need access to any sort of healthcare really took off. So I spent my time in my master's degree with Dr. Eli Rosales addressing that issue and conducting a program evaluation of whether or not the clinic had actually met that mission. So I think that's probably where all of the magic combined at that point.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense. Seeds were planted.
Totally.
So what I remember when I first reached out to you, you said, I want to talk about human rights. I was like, sure, okay, sounds cool.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't talked about that yet. Like I said, guests want to talk about cool things. So where does sort of human rights fit into all this? Are you talking about sort of, ensuring, sort of like human rights within behavior analysis, or how behavior analysis can, help with human rights in the world? What's sort of the focus, kind of the goal here?
So the focus is human rights from the perspective of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And this Declaration of Human Rights, of course, came out of post-World War II travesties with regard to Nazi Germany and the treatment of Jewish persons in throughout the course of that war. But the thought process was, which is probably really radical at the time, right? I think it was 1948. The UN General Assembly gets together, and all of these people from across the world agree that by virtue of being human, you inherently are entitled to certain rights. Has nothing to do with your race, your sex, your nationality, your ethnicity, and they go on and on, right? The language that you speak, the religion, which is a huge that's a huge undertaking, number one, for the United Nations to create this Declaration of Human Rights. And number two, such an undertaking in our world, and so easy to just watch the news and realize that most of the perils, if not all of the perils in our world with regard to human life, is because there's a violation of their rights and a violation of their inherent dignity to these and entitlement to these rights just by virtue of being human and alive. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about human rights.
And so thinking about the paper that you wrote. We have a couple papers you wrote. Specifically, there's a book chapter.
Yeah.
What's the actual book?
That the actual book. So the book chapter is. I knew you were going to ask that, Ben.
I got the chapter here, but I don't know what book it is.
No, okay, I got it. The actual book is Research Ethics and Behavior Analysis. And it's research ethics and behavior analysis from laboratory to clinic and classroom. So brand new textbook, first of its kind to talk about research ethics specifically. So there's been the Bailey and Birch text that I'm teaching out of this semester, and it's ethics for behavior analysts, but that book is more designed for practitioners working in clinical settings.
Yeah.
In this textbook for research ethics helps behavior analysts across domains, again, from laboratory to clinic and classroom, so across domains, but it's edited by David Cox and Noor Saeed and Matthew Broadhead and Sean Quigley. So highly recommend that folks get their hands on that textbook. It's actually really exciting. So the chapter we were invited to write in that textbook was a historical overview of research ethics. So we get to open when you go to write these book chapters, they don't tell you, the editors don't tell you, or they haven't told me in the chapters that I've been able to contribute to, what chapter are we going to be? You know what I mean? Like,
So
where are we going to be?
Yeah.
So we just go to writing and we're, crying tears of happiness and joy trying to get through the writing process. And we end up being chapter 1, which is so cool.
Really cool.
But it opens with just a human rights history of research ethics, specifically in behavior analysis. But the other paper that you're talking about with regard to social justice it was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice in that special issue that Denisha Jingles was the guest editor on.
Yes.
And that, and I believe Dr. Jonathan Tarbox I think he was the editor at the time.
I think you're right.
So bad.
I think you're right.
Sorry, Jonathan. My memory is not great some days, but yeah. So Denisha Jingles is the guest editor, and that paper is about social justice, kinda. Like it actually, when we wrote that manuscript, my co-authors are Dr. Eli Rosales, Rick Cruz, and Shion, and my co-authors were my doctoral dissertation committee. So this manuscript was based off of a dissertation that I had already had going in the works before the horrific and very public and often repeated murder of George Floyd was part of something that we were seeing on our devices and our televisions. We had already been doing this work and working really hard in a social justice lab at the University of North Texas, where we were interrogating these social issues and what it meant to be a behavior analyst in this context of this world that we're living in, which is an ongoing exploration that never really ends. But my interest was in what it meant to be an applied science. That's what I sought out to become very interested in and to understand. A lot of times, especially when people first enter the field or they're first learning about behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis in particular, you say, what's applied behavior analysis? Well, it's the science in which tactics, and they give you the Cooper, Heron, and Hewitt definition from their textbook. But then you ask them, okay, great. So what does applied mean? Applied means socially valid. Great. What does socially valid mean? Okay, Wolf 1978 said socially valid went. So you know what I mean? You just have this kind of stream of conversations about what it really meant. But what we really wanted to interrogate was, okay, if we are in applied science, if we take Bear-Wolf and Risley 1968 and 87, and we take conversations about what social validity means and what social invalidity means, then what does it really mean to be applied? And this was also a time where everybody was really excited about social justice. This was like the topic of the hour. And we pushed back on that. And we pushed back on that in saying that if we are truly in applied science and the dedication is to improving quality of life for animals as well, we have applied animal behaviorists that are doing wonderful work, right? Human organisms, non-human organisms, whatever it may be. If we really are dedicated to improving quality of life for whatever organism it is, then social justice is interwoven in that. Social justice is just this understanding that someone is experiencing some sort of injustice in their life, and we want to improve their life. Well, that's what applied means. So we kind of, and this is probably an unpopular opinion, right? Like, we don't need a new term in behavior analysis. We just don't. We don't need a new camp of folks, and we don't need a new championing. We need to really know what it means to be applied and live that life the way it's supposed to be lived, or the way we think it is, because we're constantly learning. Who knows?
So why do you think that would put a bad taste in some people's mouth?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that there's a little bit of confusion about what constitutes applied research in particular. And that's a definition issue. That's a semantics discussion.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the research that's published under the purview or under the title of applied may actually be translational research. I think it's probably just with human subjects or participants, probably is a better way, is how I prefer to talk about it. So human participants, but is the research question really applied in nature? Does it really have anything to do with improvement of quality of life? The answer may be no. Is it with a human? Yes. Is it dedicated to improvement of quality of life? Probably not. I think that's the biggest pushback right now. I would love if we have the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. We have the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, the Journal of Translational Behavior Analytic Research. That's not a very fun title, but you get where I'm going with that. I think we need another journal for translational literature in particular, because I think I think a lot of research is being called applied, and a lot of interventions and a lot of clinical work is being called applied, and it's not, because it's not benefiting the person's quality of life.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You just kind of did a bit of a term switch there from subjects to participants. Yes. And I think a lot of that research, they were subjects and not participants. And I think some of that speaks to, some of the stuff certainly in the book chapter around kind of the history of research, and how we sort of, looked at participants versus subjects, and subjects, in my mind, and I think, I'm sort of speculating as to sort of why you prefer the term participants, but participants implies, I think some level of consent, some idea that I know what this is about. I know what's going on with me. Whereas, subject sounds like, someone that I can do something to, that I can manipulate, that I can, experiment with, and it doesn't necessarily have to be as, sort of graphic as, although there are some examples of certainly, horrific, research. And I think that's where some of the Declaration of Human Rights came from, because I know a lot of the Nazi Germany research was definitely, and some of the Indian residential school research. There's some similar parallels there. There was, I know, in Indian residential schools, they did things like starve children to sort of test, those sorts of things. And then there was some, and there was another experiment too. It was similar. It reminds me of a couple of the example ones, like the Tuskegee and the hepatitis study, and those where I feel like there was some sort of disease kind of experimenting happened there. I think in those cases, that's where those folks are considered subjects. Why do you think it's important to sort of know the history of research in general, but also in behavior analysis?
Well, I don't think it's important to just know history. My mentor is a historian, and
Mm,
the one I spoke about that taught me what a professor was, and
mm,
taught me about what it meant to get a PhD, and you know what I mean, let me sit in his office hours asking all kinds of strange questions. And as a
mm,
historian, he didn't do the teaching of history the way high school baseball coaches did history in
mm.
high school, which was memorization of facts
Yeah.
and watching documentaries. Although those things are very important when you're understanding history, what it doesn't offer is it doesn't typically offer a humane context and a human
Mm,
context. And it also doesn't, in that way of teaching history that I was exposed to in high school, it doesn't offer students an opportunity to say, what was the historical context of the time? If we talk behavior analytically, which is totally fine in this setting, what were the contingencies that were operating in the larger social systems? What were the cultural practices of the time? How did they impact smaller groups, and how were these types of behaviors reinforced at the individual level? If you don't do that type of analysis, and you don't do that in the context of history and points in time,
mm,
what gets missed is potentially a too molecular look at why people do the things that they do.
mm,
And what history allows for students, especially the students that I teach at the University of Kansas currently, in our ethics course, for example, we start with this history. We start with a human rights understanding of what's happened over the years.
mm,
And we start with stories about Willowbrook State School, and we
mm,
start with stories about where Sunland, Miami, um, you know, uh, horrificness is like literally the only word I have right now. But we start with the history and we start with the context so that we can understand where we're sitting right now, and continue, as scientists should be doing, to say, is there something about our practices? Is there something about the questions we're asking? Is there something about the people that we're working with that could be improved? So we don't do what we did in the past, but we also don't. And this is what's happening. This is the problem with this attempt to erase history, right?
mm.
This attempt to whitewash, no pun intended, well, maybe pun intended, who knows?
Yeah.
Whitewash textbooks to say, well, let's really not talk about all of that. You take the human component out of it, and you run the risk of making the same mistakes over
Mhm.
and over and over again. And I was telling my students the other day, because you can just see their faces, there's a sense of humility with students that are learning this information, and a little bit of despair. And I promise them that things will get better as
Mm,
we move forward, but we've got to start here, and we've got to
mhm,
understand the human aspect of what's happened. And the the thought process I have is that if you remove the human aspect and you remove the human suffering aspect from your understanding of science, history, any discipline, then it, it's not a good foundation to start on.
mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. You talk about, I mean, the title of the paper that was kind of based on your dissertation,
Mhm.
moving from colonial to participatory research practices. So I want to talk about the former for a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, um, Decolonization is become a real buzzword these days. I think for good reason. I mean, I think it's important thing for sure, but it's also a kind of a big vague word too. There's the implication, and I'm not denying this, but there's sort of implication that sort of everything sort of, you know, from the moment sort of folks arrived on the soil over here to now has been in some way colonized.
Mm.
Everything is colonized, and I get it. I mean, I get sort of colonization is that's that's what that is. You go and take over the lands and either remove the peoples or get the peoples to do what you want or think the way you think or assimilate or or a lot of these terms and that's definitely a thing, and it's created and over tens and hundreds of years. There's these sorts of individual kind of behaviors and contingencies that you talk about sort of form into systems and structures that are now don't even require sort of a particular a human to even look a certain way to be in place. I think we saw the prime example recently with again around how the police sort of system is very is very biased and it's not, doesn't matter if the police are black or white. It's the system that's the problem. It's not the individuals themselves. So we see those kinds of separations, and so I get that we have all. It almost just seems like an untenable sort of goal that we basically need to somehow. And maybe this isn't what we need to do, but it sometimes implies, without sort of giving more context and description, that decolonization means we just need to sort of kind of start over again, from the beginning. And I think of the interview I did with Tiffany Hammond, and she talks, and she's a autism advocate. She talks a lot about autistic black autistic woman, mother of an autistic child. She talks a lot about she's deep into the sort of ABA sort of abuse reform kind of argument and or discussion, and she says it's got nothing to do about whether ABA is good or bad. It's got to do with all the systems that ABA grew out of in the first place, back in the day, like, before even, pre-Skinner even, and sort of, and that they were all built on these sort of colonized, structures and systems that were in place. And so we got to this place from that place. And so there was always sort of, it's almost like colonization is like this taint, in the water that is just always there and slowly kind of, sometimes poisoning a fish or two, and then someone eats that fish, and then someone else eats the thing that eats the fish, and it just gets everywhere. And so and then there's this move to decolonize. These just sound like really big grand sort of super ideas that I think are important, but I have no idea how to do them. And so I think first off, you need to kind of at least focus on one sort of area. And so that's what we're doing. We're talking about our field behavior analysis. We're not talking about the entire planet and the world and everything right at this moment. We want to move from colonial to participatory research practices. What do we mean by colonial research practices and behavior analysis? What does that, I know it's based on sort of a lot of this. We won't go through all the examples of like Willowbrook and all those things of sort of how science was so sketchy back in the day. But what makes sort of current kind of ABA research practices per se colonial? Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. Whom House offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, Whom House has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to whomhouse.com/speak or search Whom House on Google. The second secret word is rights. RIGHTS.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is also a rabbit hole that I went down And I had to be pulled back from, I went back to the University of North Texas to get my PhD with Dr. Shalalai Rosales because I knew that she was the only mentor I wanted to work with. I really wasn't interested in getting a PhD at the time that I decided to go back to school just to get one.
Mm.
I had been in clinical work for a very long time, and I was very interested in doing what you're supposed to do when you get a PhD, which is really become so ridiculously invested in a very particular area of whatever subject matter you're interested in,
Mhm.
but then also trying to draw these lines of distinction, perhaps, and connections with other disciplines and pieces of the world a lot of times. And so I was sitting in sitting in Shala's office, and I was reading Steve Fawcett's paper published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1991 about community-based participatory research
Mm.
and bringing that to bear to applied behavior analysis and research practices. Do you know what I mean? And
Mm.
so I'd read this paper over and over again. I got a little obsessed with it. It was, I had, I apologize to the trees that I wasted because I still have a need to learn with paper and pen. So I had printed off the article, highlighted it, written in the margins so much that I had torn the papers and needed to recycle that version and printed it off again. And at one point in time, Dr. Fawcett mentions that persons that agree to participate in research should not become the silent, subservient targets of research. And that was really powerful for me to read. And he specifically said the word colonial. We should not be engaging in colonial relationships with research participants. And he was the first to introduce in that paper the difference between subject and participant. And so these core critical pieces of information in that article really struck a lot of chords with me. And that started the colonial rabbit hole that I went down. From what I understand, I did the going back in the reference section and seeing who Dr. Fawcett had referenced. From what I understand, Dr. Fawcett was the first one in behavior analysis to use the word colonial in this regard. So
Wow.
he gets the credit for that. I decided that we could expand not just colonial practices with regard to subject versus participant, right? Not just with regard to the subject, but for the entire research process
Yes.
in particular. So colonial research practices is really something that I came up with in our social justice lab as I was mulling over my dissertation and my research. Now, decolonialization is a completely different topic. And luckily, Dr. Cruz is on my dissertation committee and helped me in my lab and helped us in our lab understand that there's a difference between terminology. So there's colonialism, there's decolonization, but then there's also another term in anthropology and sociology called decoloniality. And the more that I was talking about decolonization, because it's a very popular term and was a popular term at the time I was writing, Dr. Cruz said, you're not talking about decolonization. Decolonization is the literal transition of land, right? This settler, native, slave kind of triad of colonization, and has to do with physical land. And so there's an article that's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. So, and this is by Tuck and Yang. And so they talk about the fact that we shouldn't talking about decolonizing our schools or colonizing methods or decolonizing science. That was one thing that I had seen. But instead, what we're talking about these systems that have to do with decoloniality, and decoloniality being systems that govern a lot of different practices across societies that are steeped in this white Eurocentric way of being right and correct. In science, and the science of behavior analysis, by being part of this overarching societal structure, has these origins and these assumptions of what is right, what is research, what is data. So those were several different rabbit holes that I went down, and several different conversations and a lot of drafts and a lot of rewriting to come up with, okay, what does colonial research methods mean? Well, I mean, if we really want to be very, just put it in a short sentence and put it in a nugget, the thought process is that, like colonial, if you want to use a metaphor, like a colonial type of endeavor in history, someone comes to someone's land, someone decides that they want to extract something from the land, or the person's on the land, or both, for their own need, for their own good. They take whatever they extract from persons or the land, and then they use it to benefit, and they commodify it for something else that they need, and exchanges for other things. And so that's basically where we landed on that, is that we need to be careful about a research process that just capitalizes on a population, sometimes a vulnerable population, who may or may not really understand what the research is all about. We extract information from them, which is behavior data in the purview of behavior analysis, and then we use that behavior data to publish it, to get tenure, to make journal publications, and potentially make more money and write books and whatever it may be. And then when the research endeavor is over, we leave. We don't come back. We're not sure if the person's any better in the long run. So I'm oversimplifying this process, right?
Yeah.
And I am also very, very cognizant of saying, I am part of this system as well. I am not this outsider looking in saying, this is not how to do research. My thought process is, how have we done research in the past? Are there indicators of colonial research practices? And as Fawcett mentioned in 1991, what is a more participatory and what is a more community-based participatory approach to research? And hopefully shifting applied back to shifting the applied research towards research that is more socially valid, dedicated to improvement of human life throughout the onset and beyond research context.
That makes more sense to me than I thought it would.
Thank goodness. It took a lot of energy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It answers my question, but I just want to try to paraphrase in case it didn't answer my question for anyone else. What I'm hearing is sort of taking that sort of the idea of actual colonization. But let's look at history and actually coming over. I think the slavery conversation is a little more complicated because
because humans were the commodity in that.
But also because it started over in Africa. Like it didn't start. Slavery didn't start in North America. I think that's something that people sometimes kind of can think. Like it started over there and they brought them over to North America. I know that's maybe a surface level way of looking at it, but I wanted to use sort of indigenous peoples as a different example, maybe a simpler example, because they were already here.
Yes.
And then colonizers just came over and basically said, this is the way we think the world should be. This is the way we think you should be. We're going to make these decisions based on essentially our biases, and you're either going to follow suit, or we're going to make you follow suit, and that's going to be for the best of everybody and for the best of the world, and so on and so forth. That I think that's a very simple sort of description of what colonization essentially is. And we're going to take all your land, away from you, of course, and make it ours. And it was never yours in the first place. You were just sort of bugs that were going to sweep off the table, as it were, and make it ours. And so I get where sort of decolonization, the term decolonization, because in the Indigenous conversations I've been having a lot and reading a lot here, one of the big slogans is land back.
Yes.
And they're and working towards, getting the land that we literally stole from these folks. And so that makes sense to me, that decolonization is returning the land, and because colonization is taking the land, decolonization is returning the land. It also makes sense to me just to use that as a metaphor, and if this was your intention, and apply it to behavior and analytic research, and or just research in general, in that right now, and again, I'm not a researcher, but as I understand it, sort of right now, the sort of typical way a research study comes into play, if it's not a replication study, is somebody says, I think this is important. And I think, we need to look at this, and we need to prove whether what I think is important is accurate or wrong or whatever. But I think we need to look at this group of people, because there's a problem with this group of people, that we need to fix. And we can fix it by, selecting this group this way, and applying interventions or whatever, to these people in the way we think makes sense, and then we'll decide if the results are useful or not, and so on and so forth. So it's really us. It's a very controlling kind of way of looking at things, and it's a very biased way of looking at things. So if I have a bias that says, I have a bias based on ableism and, say, racism. We'll just use the two of them, that says, that Black autistic kids should, I don't know, do something, because I think that's just the way it is. Because my perspective is that they should do it like we white non-autistic folks do it. Then I ask but the research question of itself doesn't come out so blatantly racist. It's just sort of we need to teach Billy to use a knife and fork at dinner, but culture, but we don't take the cultural piece intact, that his family doesn't use forks. They never did and they never will, but we're going to teach them to use a fork because that's what we do. That's my bias, and now I'm going to recruit a bunch of folks, and teach them all to use forks, and then in the end it's going to be a successful study, because now I've got 30 kids that are using forks that didn't before, and that'll get published for sure, because I did everything right. But that's a very that has no meaning to those kids. That has no meaning to those families, to those communities. That was all a bias. It was a bias from the very beginning. And it's interesting that, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Kristen Botama-Butel's work. I might have brought her up in a previous conversation that I forgot to press record for. But she's a psychologist and a researcher, and I had her on the podcast, so it'll be coming out soon. And she and her team essentially analyzed most ABA research, and she wasn't looking specifically at colonialism, but she was looking at sort of things like bias and conflict of interest, and adverse effects reporting, and how most ABA research doesn't have any of those things in the right way. Like we don't report bias. We only report bias maybe if it's really obvious, but because so much bias is implicit, we don't report it. And I won't spoil the podcast, but her research essentially suggests that most ABA research isn't really, the outcomes aren't really valid, because because of this, essentially this colonial approach, and not sort of reporting all these other pieces that kind of led them to come to these conclusions, and also led them to, do these studies in the first place. I gotta listen again. ADHD's kicking in. I gotta listen to the episode again and edit it and remember everything she said to really be accurate with it. But it just makes me think of, everything we're doing, comes from a place of bias when we do research, and the way we recruit is often very, sketchy. The way we, accommodate for the needs of sort of, we do a lot of autism research, so the way we accommodate for the needs of autistic folks, whether it's sensory issues or whatnot, we don't really deal with any of those things. We're very observable behavior only, so we don't consider, often, particularly in our, in our clients that are maybe non-focal, we don't consider private events because they're not talking about them, and there's a whole bunch of things that we just sort of don't do in research, and we've really treated these folks like subjects, and not participants, and so I think I was trying to paraphrase, and then I rabbit holed, but
It's okay.
but I think that's part of the reason, I think, for sort of Fawcett wanting to bring in this sort of participatory action approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think, we've in previous podcast episodes that will never be heard because we didn't remember to record our previous conversations. We've disagreed about this, right? So I take, for once in my life, a more conservative standpoint about something. And this something is that my more conservative and inductive approach to looking at data that I look at, with regard to publication trends in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in particular, is that I can't make these. There's no way for us to know what the research context was that was. There's no way for us to observe, measure, record over time. What we only have is we have the permanent product that is journal publications.
Right.
So I take a much more conservative approach to, have applied researchers been doing applied behavior analytic research over the years? And the purview is, again, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis from 1968. In this case, for the first 50 years of the journal's existence. I can't make sweeping, for sure statements about what happened. It's impossible. What I can say is, if all we wanted to know was whether or not the authors reported and published that they gained consent, informed consent, if all we want to know is, did they mention any assent practices? Did they mention the race of the person that they served? Did they mention the age? You know what I mean? Like, I can tell from a permanent product whether or not the journal article contained that information. What I can't do is, not in an inductive way, look at it and make these generalizations about the entire field of applied behavior analytic research practices as a whole. What we can do, however, is we can say that at bare minimum, when you do your IRB process, and when you set up a research and project, and you submit, and on and on and on throughout these processes, we do know over time these processes have changed, but as we stand today, we do know that you need to provide consent. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's certain things, according to the Belmont report, that says respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. This is our bare minimum. This is our bottom line, right? These are our core principles to working with human participants in biomedical and behavioral research. Everybody understands that, right? So what we can do is we can say, well, where do we measure up to those bare minimums? Where do we measure up to those core principles that the institutional review boards abide by? And that is a better and more objective way of looking at our research practices as a field, instead of wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, if there's not a better metaphor that I can think of. And on top of everything else, and we talk about this in the research ethics chapter, we've come a long way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Fuller was talking about this research subject that they had an opportunity was provided to them to engage in this research, and it was, the first of its kind with regard to human operant research, and groundbreaking in 1949, right?
Mm.
And we're not saying Fuller is a bad person, right? You're just a person operating in the contingencies and the
Mm-hmm.
context of your environment, and science progresses. That's the
Mm-hmm.
nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
Environments change, we change with them. And so the thought process is, okay, well, if our bottom line is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, then how well are we doing with our measures? And how well are we doing with the setup of the research endeavor that respects those principles,
Mm.
right? And make sure that they withstand. So, we've had these conversations, you and I, Ben, and I'm so much more optimistic about people doing good in life,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's the way that I need to live, so that I don't go to that dark place when I was 16 years old, realizing that humans do awful things to other humans. That's a very terrible place to live in your head.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's a coping skill that I've learned over time to say, and behavior analysis saved my worldview. Being a radical behavior has saved my life in so many respects, right?
Mm.
It helps me to have a science of human behavior, a science of behavior, period, to help me understand why people do the things that they do. It doesn't make me
Mm.
less emotional when horrific things happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't take the humanness out of who I am, but it helps me ground myself and gives me a way to understand why people do the things they do, and how do we shift contexts, including research contexts, to make sure that suffering doesn't continue to perpetuate.
Mm.
That's something I can sleep with at night.
Mm. Yeah. So yeah, I guess we do disagree a little bit. So,
Which is fine.
but I think you make a point that I hadn't sort of considered, and that's that, there's nothing, and I think this is what Dr. Batema Bitel's work is about. It's about not reporting things, not talking about things. And I think you talk about that, not talking about asset, not talking about all these sorts of things. And I think you're right. I think you're right. We have no way to know that they didn't do any of those things. We have no way to know if, unless you talk to the researcher themselves, or you happen to be a lab assistant, and you get a hold of them, and you can, get that information about that story, about kind of where it came from. But
Right.
so that's fair. Alleged, until proven in court, sort of thing.
We also don't know if the authors wrote that information and the journal said, this is too many lines, too many words, take it out. We just run under this fundamental
really
assumption. Back in the day, you used to have to print these things. This was a lot of effort.
No, I think, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So again, we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. But now we have better measures, perhaps, and better context. And maybe another portion of it is accountability with each other, and asking each other, what's going on in your lab? Like, where did you come up with these research questions? Is this really an applied question? Those I think are more helpful for scientists to do with each other than pointing fingers and saying, you're being inhumane, your lab is horrible, stop doing this research. There's a lot of danger in that type of discourse.
Yeah. Although, and I won't go too deep into this, but you did sort of touch on it briefly, and so it gave me a little bit of an opening,
Of course.
where you talked about behavior analysis doing good things for all organisms, and some of the animal research. And I'm still looking to do an episode on this. I need to find the right person to interview and have this conversation with. But I have a lot of struggles with animal research in experimental analysis of behavior, particularly I can sort of live with maybe, birds pecking for stuff, and not even I can't even do well with that stuff, because I struggle with animals in captivity in general, as a thing. But I definitely struggle with sort of the studies where they give them drugs, or they mess around with their brains and put electrodes on them, and all that kind of crazy psychedelic stuff. Like, I think it's interesting that we have these applied fields that are there to do good things for organisms, but then we have experimental areas that are actually exploiting organisms to meet their needs. But I don't want to take over the podcast topic on that one, because that's not what we're talking about today. But it does I do struggle a bit with sort of the idea that we can have applied animal research that's doing good for animals, while at the same time we're storing rats and birds in cages for their entire lives, and jabbing their brains with electrodes and that sort of thing for the good of humans. I don't know why.
Remember that movie? Oh no, just because it's because we're not being exclusionary to organisms, and we're talking about research.
Yeah.
Remember that movie called Fern Gully? Did you ever see that movie?
I remember the title. I don't remember seeing it.
So it's this movie about rainforests, and it's for children, but the story is about rainforests and cutting down rainforest, and Robin Williams plays the character of a bat that's been experimented on, and he's got a wire coming out of his head, and there's fairies. There's a human that gets fairy size, so all of a sudden his world gets turned upside down because he's seeing everything from a fairy's perspective. And not to trivialize your point about animal research or just the treatment of organisms, period, in many contexts, I don't want to trivialize that, but I remember watching that as a child and understanding all of that. And I think that's why I like hanging out with children so much, because they seem to have more of an understanding of, oh yeah, this big dude was cutting down these trees, and then he got shrunk down to the size of this fairy who depended on the trees for a living and had a very spiritual relationship with the trees. There's elders in the story, although it's an animated cartoon, although it's old and outdated now, according to the animation that I see, which blows my mind. I just saw Avatar, but Avatar is another one of these animated movies that talks about these really important topics. And well, now I'm down a rabbit hole, but anyway, it reminded me, as you were talking about me as a child feeling very sad for, his name was Batty, that was his character, and he was like, I had to ask my dad, like, why does he have this thing? It was very odd to me that this animal had this wire thing coming out of his head, and he would short circuit, and it was supposed to be funny, you know what I mean? And it was hysterical as a child. But I think that that's a way for people. Sometimes people are able to write, make animation, to kind of make sense of strange things. I love stand-up comedy and live music, which is living in the capital of Texas. Austin is that's what we do. We do live music and comedy shows, and that's kind of another thing that I use to cope. But I don't think you're alone in this thought process of what are we doing and how we can do better. I think where I get really nervous, especially for our field, if I'm being completely transparent, which I am always, which sometimes gets me in bad positions, I'm very worried about behavior analysis right now as a field, and this polarizing way in which people are setting up arguments or having discussions about very difficult topics. Like, are you serious? You seriously think that you have it solved with how to solve racism as a problem? Because I'm pretty sure if you knew how to solve this problem, it wouldn't be a problem right now. You know what I mean? And for humans to pretend like they have all of the answers, myself included, I need to be checked often, and I surround myself with people who check me often.
Mm.
This is a very dangerous vibe right
Mm.
now in behavior analysis, and you can see it happening in conversations that you overhear at conferences. You can see it happening in protesters, for instance, outside of our ABAI conference in Boston last year, from the community about electric shock. And then you can see it in position statements and voting, and you know, behavior analysts having really insensitive conversations about race and racism on listservs. It goes on and on and on. And it is a very concerning time to be a behavior analyst for me, because I don't like, as much as it doesn't seem like it, I do not like confrontation, and I do not like really, really difficult conversations. But I really don't like when power dynamics seem to shift left and right, and everybody seems to say that they are right and they are right. And it really makes me uncomfortable. And I don't know what to do with that discomfort except for sit with it at this point in time. But I also really don't want listeners to think that, well, I listened to this podcast and Dr. Malika Pritchett said, like, I am just a human operating in this flesh thing that I carry around on my bones, and I'm just behaving in the same context or similar context based on my history of learning. Like, no organism is better than the other, and these solutions are not easy solutions. But I also know that if we're actually going to make any impactful change in our world, and change some of these horrific things that have happened with any human organism, that we're going to have to eventually work together. Like, each individual person can't solve these types of problems. But I'm today, as we sit, Black History Month, February 2023, I'm very worried for the divisiveness and the divide in our field. And I don't know. I'm optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't know why I said all that, Ben.
Is it surprising? No, it's really. Is it surprising, though, that there's a divide, considering the divide there currently is in the world, with sort of everything, I mean.
No. And that's a really good point. That makes me feel a lot better, right? So the science of behavior analysis is just another set of, it's just another social environment that is not influenced by contingencies in other systems and societies. So yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, it's not to say either that sort of the people on, on one side are bad people and the people on the other side are good people either. But it there's just so much polarization now in the country, in both countries. In Canada, a lot of what's happening in the U.S. is happening in Canada too, more and more. It's getting scarier and scarier as far as sort of some of these opinions. I think Canada just happens to have, a few laws that we've had in place for quite a while that prevent some of the things from happening in the States that are from happening here. But beyond that, the conversations are just as vitriol. They just don't have the means to sort of, hurt people as easily here as they do other places. But they're finding ways, for sure. I don't know, we just had an incident of a school bus driver driving a bus into a daycare intentionally. So,
oh my gosh,
you don't need gun laws to hurt people. But anyway, yeah, no, and I think part of it is, I think the only thing we can do in our field sort of with this stuff is try to listen and kind of keep having conversations, and at some point you got to kind of make the decision that, okay, I'm talking to a brick wall here. There's nothing's going to change the mind of sort of these 6 people or whatever. And so don't worry about them. Those 6 people aren't going to take over the field and make all the decisions for us. There's let's talk to the people that are interested. And I think there's a lot of people that just don't know, and they're all kind of stuck in the middle. And so with that in mind, I don't want to take too much longer in this chat today, but I would like to talk a little bit about the positive side of this whole story, and that's the moving to. So maybe because I think we could maybe just talk a little bit more about sort of what participatory research is, and kind of what it can look like. I think folks our arguments against participatory research haven't been sort of that it's bad or useless, but it's that it takes too much effort. It takes too much time. I had Grant Bruno on the podcast at episode 37. He's not a big analyst, but he's a Indigenous guy, father of a autistic boy, and he's doing community participatory research with the Indigenous community, and he has no idea. At the time of the interview, which was last fall, he had no idea what his research was going to be on, or what the research question was going to be, or any of that stuff, or who or where he was going to go. But he was in his PhD program and he was doing research. And how is that possible? Well, he was doing this thing called community participatory research, where the first step is going to, the community, whatever that might be. I think for autism research, that's got to be the autism community. For deaf research, that's going to be the deaf community, and so on. And he wants to do research in the Indigenous community. And so the first thing he's doing is he's building relationships in the Indigenous community. He's formed these kind of men's circles. He's got a men's circle, and I think I'm butchering a bit of this because some of the stuff is just stuff he's doing separate, just within his community. But he's got this sort of circle of basically Indigenous elders and Indigenous community members, and he calls it a circle. I can't remember what type of circle he calls it. But he's basically meeting with them on a regular basis to try to see sort of, what areas do you folks need help with? What areas do you folks need change in? What kinds of research would you like to see happen that would benefit you and your community? And that is step. And I think, and I don't know what I've never read about participatory research and sort of the steps or whatnot. But that seems like that's sort of step one but before you don't even need to have a research question when you're doing your PhD, because you shouldn't have one. You should be getting it from the community. And that's kind of where he's at. And I don't even think he's at the question yet. And this was, it's been 6 or 8 months now.
Yeah. Well, community-based participatory research, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Community-based participatory research comes from an action research paradigm. And action research has an underlying assumption that there's some sort of injustice that we need to take action on, hence the name, right? So that's why it's important also for scholars and researchers to understand who informed and what informed this research methodology. So you can't have community-based participatory research without the understanding that there's some sort of population that we could probably consider a vulnerable population, and the issue that they need solved is probably some sort of injustice, some sort of disparity they're experiencing, something happening in their lived, local, real context. And so I think that's the future of applied behavior analysis. I think that's where we're pushing, right? We're pushing more towards understanding people's voices, understanding, listening to what people are saying that they're having difficulty with, sitting. I was lucky enough to have an applied anthropologist on my dissertation committee to help me understand what all of this meant from a research methodology standpoint, and sitting with information and understanding the origin of the research question. And the origin of the research question, this is Beowulf and Risley. This is not Malika Pritchett. So I get to hand it off to those before me. But the origin of the research question should be organic and from the people, not from the researcher.
Mm.
This is not my words. This is
Mhm.
Beowulf and Risley. Look it up. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
And so that's what I think we need to continue to do as applied behavior analysts that are conducting
Mhm.
research or that are digesting research, is to start
Mhm.
asking those questions like, where did this question come from?
Mm.
And if the origin of this question is from people, that's a really important line of research just by virtue of being how we intersect with people in society and how we bring the
Mm.
science of behavior analysis into people's lives. And I think that's a cool thing. Like, I
Yeah.
love being a behavior analyst. I can't wait. And another thing that's happening that I think is really inspirational is podcasts like yours, talking to additional people, asking them about what they're doing, and also the teaching, which is where I'm having the most fun in my life right now, the teaching of the next generation of behavior analysts.
Mhm.
And I can see with my students in particular, they're really thinking, and they're thinking deeply, and it is not easy. This is not an easy process,
Mm.
right? To think deeply and interrogate as you're learning the science of applied behavior analysis. But I see lots of programs changing their readings, changing how they introduce certain topics. Like, we are
Mm.
still behavior analysts, we are still scientists. This is still a very powerful and promising science. We also are taking into account additional contingencies operating on our own behavior and the behavior of others, and in continuing to hold that on down the line.
Mhm. Mhm.
And collaboration's not a bad word. And you can keep the internal validity of your experiment and still collaborate with participants in the community.
Zigzag is an autism therapy management platform. At its core, Zigzag seamlessly allows management of programs, adding, editing, changing long term and short term objectives on the go. Zigzag makes data collection super easy for therapists on site and automatically calculates progress, providing you with session summaries and graphs in real time. Zigzag provides you the ability to manage all of your clients, whether they be center or home based, and work with all the various therapists and parents seamlessly. Zigzag is based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and is fully compliant with both federal and provincial privacy requirements. Book a demo now at www.zigzagkid.com/product demo and get a free 30-day trial. The third secret word is invalidity. INVALIDITY. Absolutely. And I think I've talked quite a bit. We've talked quite a bit here and in other interviews about sort of that part. So we got to get the. Are there other things about participatory research practices beyond sort of, getting your research question from the community? Like, are there other things that that sort of are part of that?
Yeah, and I really, again, Steve Fawcett's paper in 1991 is a huge influence on how I frame community-based participatory research and my understanding with regard to behavior analysis. But another piece of it is, at the outset of research, can the effects be maintained by the local community themselves, right? So you come in, you do great work. Can they sustain these wonderful changes after the
Yes.
researcher leaves? Does their quality of life continue to be improved because of the researcher's presence? Did you teach skills related to empowerment? Did you teach skills related to self-advocacy, determination, that ensure that people that agree to participate in research have their life improved, don't still depend on the researcher for continued life improvement? So there's a lot of different indicators that Dr. Fawcett outlined in that article that I think are great indicators and great questions to ask at the beginning of research, throughout research, and beyond, which is really cool. Does the research take place in the natural setting? What's the setting? Do you know what I mean? So again, these are not boxes to check off in your research agenda. You know, are there community stakeholders involved? Yes or no? Check yes or no. Is life improvement or empowerment a dependent variable, yes or no. This is not a checkoff list, right?
Mm,
But it should be more of an organic and participatory process. And I think that that's cool stuff.
hmm. Yeah, that is cool.
And it does take time, like you were mentioning. Community-based participatory research sometimes mean you're sitting there observing for a long time and listening for a
Hmm.
long time,
Hmm.
especially if it's a community that you're an outsider of, that you do not
Hmm.
belong to.
Hmm.
Anthropologists are very good at that type of research endeavor, or research practice rather.
Yeah, one of my supervisees is he's got his undergrads in anthropology, and I've been learning so much from him. He's always applying that anthropology lens to things. I think it's a one of many things that might be missing from some of our training for sure. Um, yeah, that's cool. So are people doing this?
Yeah.
I
Thank
mean,
goodness.
I've seen a couple examples. Like I said, I found a couple folks on the podcast, but it doesn't seem as common. Like when I'm sort of reading the research, and maybe is that maybe because, like you said earlier, that maybe it's just the journals not wanting all that info.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
or I'm
I
just not reading the
I
right stuff.
well, this is not. I'm not in a position, I should say, to make a sweeping
Sure.
statement about what folks are doing or not doing, because even through your podcast you're telling me about all these wonderful people. I'm like, I had no idea what that person who that person was and what they were
Right.
doing, which is
Right.
really really indicative of us just needing to do this more often. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's one of the reasons why I am so incredibly stoked to be at the University of Kansas, because I
Mm,
get to be at the birthplace of applied behavior analysis in particular, continue my interrogation of what applied really means through
mm,
my research and teaching, but then also to work alongside scholars who are doing applied research that is incredible and wonderful and meaningful.
mm,
And I spent the last year and a half working alongside Dr. Jamila Watson Thompson,
mm,
and her research and her team's research and she was mentored by Dr. Steve Fawcett. And the team continues to engage in community-based participatory research specifically related to violence reduction, gun violence in particular,
yes.
and youth violence reduction. And that the future of behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis in particular, is this prevention direction, right? So we've
Mm,
learned so much about what causes challenging behaviors and what causes people to be in distress and the
mm,
environmental conditions under which. Now the future that I'm hopeful for and I'm excited about is, how can we set up the environment to prevent these ills from happening in the first place? And what are the critical skills that we can teach that prevent suffering from in the first place? And so I am very spoiled at the Department of Applied Behavior Science at the University of Kansas, because I get to see this every day, and I get to see what I'm knowing is the future of applied behavior analysis unfold through teaching students and having them teach me. So I'm so fortunate. And yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening, which is really cool.
mm. Yeah, I keep forgetting about all the cool stuff that's happening in Kansas. I think also I think some of this stuff isn't always getting, because of the nature of the work, it isn't necessarily getting published in like JABA or whatever. It's getting published in kind of other journals often.
Sure.
And
Behavior and social issues is deserves a considerable shout out for publishing some really critical research in this area. But then sometimes, like you're right, community psychology sometimes gets some of this love from this line of research, and journals like that. So
mm,
yeah, I think things are being published. I think that it requires students and researchers to broaden their horizons into other disciplines and work with other disciplines. And that's how science progresses. We learn what we
yeah,
don't know and we continue on, and the hope moving forward is that humans aren't collateral damage for the process.
Right on. Yeah, in fact, the episode I released today, you'll see it has the call for papers for the behavior and social issues, literacy and social justice
Awesome.
thing that's coming out, and so that sounds pretty awesome.
Well, Ben, can I be your first repeat guest? Will you bring me back?
100%. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sold. Well, in that vein, maybe the final question is, I know at University of Kansas, you're probably initially just doing a lot of soaking in and learning, sponging from sort of all these amazing people like Dr. Jamila there, and so many more. But do you have any sort of projects on the go or starting or thinking about that we'll be able to talk about next time you come?
Yeah. So I kind of invited myself back to your podcast so that I can set up so you can be my accountability partner.
Right.
And the accountability is that my colleagues and I have been writing a paper about behavior analysis in public schools and equity with regard to providing behavioral services in public school settings, specifically using the framework of abolitionism and using that framework of abolitionism as a system altering change to ensure that Black and Brown students aren't disproportionately impacted by behavior modification, not modification, that's such an old term, but by behavior interventions in the sense of disproportionate impact of Black and Brown students bear on being suspended, sent to detention, expelled from school settings, and how behavior analysts working in public schools in the US, and we're also going to bring in conversations about the Indigenous boarding schools in Canada and how the school setting really is not this island of a setting that doesn't directly have to do with the contingencies operating in the broader parts of society, and how behavior analysts can avoid being complicit in just writing behavior programs to reduce challenging behaviors that don't potentially perpetuate disparities in disciplinary standards in school settings. So that is what I'm working on now. And as you can imagine, it is a lot of thinking, and it's a kind of an emotional labor along the way with that conceptual piece. But when I come back, I'd love to tell you that we're finished with the manuscript and we've sent it off to see if it'll be published, or maybe when we talk again, it'll be published.
Yeah.
But that's the future, and that's what
Cool.
I'm working on right now. And my students are super excited about it. So I'd love to talk about that next time.
I will hold you to it for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I need that.
Absolutely. And especially there's a lot of those boarding schools in the States too. So
I do.
And a lot of those stories there. And
very hard to research and read about.
Yes. Well, it's maybe we opened with a territorial acknowledgement and a little bit of talk about the local First Nations here. We can close with that too. That's been the real struggle up here for those First Nations, is that these, there's been a lot of, uncovering of these child graves all across Canada and in some places in the States as well. But the First Nations are struggling to get, records from these schools, because it was the church that kept all those records. And in fact, that was there was a group of sort of what's the term I'm looking for? Delegates, a group of Indigenous delegates went to meet the Pope last year, or he came here. I can't remember. Anyway, but a group of delegates met the Pope, and kind of we're trying to ask some of these questions, because the Vatican seems to hold a lot of these records about sort of who these children were, who went to the school, the processes, all that kind of paperwork. It's all been kind of being held, and they've been really trying to fight to get that. So I have no doubt that you'll struggle to find information, because the Indigenous communities themselves can't get that information. So that's pretty wretched.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And that requires more than a land acknowledgement, right? Like that kind of speaks to how we entered this conversation. Like, that's one way to start. Just start moving the needle, a tiny direction. The other end of it, as we close out, is we're talking about human lives, right? And we're talking about impact. So it's not about the intent of what we do as behavior analysts. A lot of times it's about the impact. And we will do better.
Yeah. Well, I feel bad for the folks that didn't get to hear our last conversation, because this one was quite different than the last one that we didn't press record for. There was a lot of things in here. There's a lot of things in my notes that I just didn't even bother reading today that I could have. I think last time when we talked a lot more about I think the actual history and the text in those articles, but those are available. Buy that research and ethics book, and you can learn all that history yourself. This was awesome. And yeah, you're definitely welcome back anytime you want. Yeah, super cool. Thanks for coming.
Awesome. I'll be back, and thank you for having me again, Ben. It's been awesome.
Cool.